On December 14, 1991, a schoolgirl disappeared without a trace in broad daylight in the parking lot of her own school in Federal Way near Seattle. Sarah Yarbrough, 16 years old, was a member of the cheerleading team at Federal Way High School. On that Saturday morning, the team was supposed to leave together for a competition. But Sarah was early. She got the departure time wrong and arrived an hour early. When her teammates arrived later, her car was in the parking lot, but there was no sign of Sarah. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, two 12-year-old boys went to the school grounds to run around and explore. When they reached the wooded area behind the tennis courts, they saw a strange man stepping out of the bushes. He was tall, had long blonde hair, and was wearing dark clothes. He glanced at them briefly and then walked in the opposite direction. The boys thought he was strange, but not dangerous, until they came across something just a few meters further on that they would never forget. A girl was lying on the ground between the trees, motionless. Her clothes were partially disheveled, her face marked with dark spots and dirt. The boys were frightened, ran home, and informed their parents. While one of the boys' fathers called 911, the other tried to follow the strange man. His son told him that he saw a vehicle that looked like a Chevrolet Nova driving away from the scene. Since he lived near the school, the father decided to drive to the street and try to find the car. Eventually, he managed to spot a similar vehicle, but it quickly disappeared from view and the man was unable to find it again. A short time later, police officers arrived at the scene. It quickly became clear that the girl was dead. It was Sarah Yarbrough. Investigators found her jacket, socks, and underwear near the body, and her wallet and car keys were still in her car. There was no indication that Sarah had gone with anyone voluntarily. The police secured the crime scene and immediately began their investigation. The cause of death was quickly determined. Sarah had been strangled with her own tights. In addition, the medical examiner found a severe head injury that had probably caused her to lose consciousness before she was killed. This suggested that the perpetrator had beaten her unconscious before dragging her into the nearby woods. At around the same time as the boys, a jogger had noticed a man bent over a motionless girl. However, he thought they were a couple who wanted to retreat into the woods, a misunderstanding that would later cause much discussion. He did not intervene, but later reported what he had seen to the police. His description also matched that of the children. A young man with long blonde hair in his early 20s wearing dark clothing. Investigators followed the initial leads. Particularly striking was the fact that traces of male semen were found on almost all of the victims' clothing. They clearly came from a single person. However, there were no signs of a classic sexual assault. Forensic experts concluded that the perpetrator had probably committed lewd acts while the girl was unconscious or already dead. A DNA database as we know it today did not exist at the time. DNA could only be compared directly with samples from suspects, and so far, there had been no matches. Investigators created a composite sketch of the suspect based on the statements of the children and the jogger. This image was distributed throughout the region. The public was shocked and the murder was the topic of conversation throughout Washington state. The fact that a young girl had been murdered on school grounds on a Saturday morning without anyone intervening in time left many people stunned. The investigation was in full swing. Within a few days, officers had spoken to over 70 people who had been on or near the school grounds on the morning of December 14, 1991. Hundreds of tips were received by the police. The media reported daily on the murder, and the students at Federal Way High School lived in fear from then on. The girls in particular avoided walking alone on the grounds. The boys from the football and track teams volunteered to accompany their female classmates to cars or buses. The school tried to return to normal, but the shadow of the crime remained. The police followed up on every lead, almost 4,000 over time. In one case, the description seemed to fit. a man with a criminal record who matched the composite sketch, but his DNA did not match the evidence found at the scene. And that was the catch. As long as no suitable suspect could be found who was also willing to provide a DNA sample, the investigation was at a standstill. Sarah's grandfather, who worked for a large technology company, convinced his company to provide the police with a high-performance computer worth $150,000. In the 1990s, this was an enormous help. Finally, all the clues could be stored centrally and evaluated efficiently. But despite this technical support, the investigation remained at a standstill. 2 years later, Sarah's former classmates graduated. A metal bench was erected in her memory, decorated with miniature replicas of Sarah's favorite possessions and a statue of her dog, lovingly snapping at her handbag as he used to do. The memorial was not only intended to commemorate her, but also to give hope that justice would prevail someday. In the years that followed, the case was regularly reopened. Investigators repeatedly examined the old leads, but to no avail. The officers interviewed thousands of people and took almost 300 DNA samples, but none of them matched. Hope faded. Then, 20 years after the murder, a new investigator had an idea. He wanted to use genetic genealogy, a method that was still new at the time and could be used to identify perpetrators through their family relationships. The investigator turned to a company that specialized in this field. The experts took on the case, but in 2011, the technology was still in its infancy. For example, it was not possible to find both male and female relatives with only one male DNA sample. In addition, legal regulations restricted the use of genetic data. Nevertheless, the investigators came across an interesting connection. The perpetrator was related to Robert Fuller, one of the passengers on the Mayflower, the famous ship that sailed from England to the New World in 1620. But this lead didn't help. Today, around 25 million Americans are descended from the few passengers who sailed on the Mayflower. Finding a specific perpetrator in this crowd seemed hopeless. The investigator found several men named Fuller who had lived in the region at the time of the crime and asked them for DNA samples. One was indeed a descendant of Robert Fuller, but not the murderer. In 2017, the investigator retired, but the case was not shelved. A new team took over with new methods and new databases. They contacted the genetic genealogy company again, and this time, with better technology and more comprehensive information, a picture finally began to emerge. It took 2 years before the genetic data finally yielded a promising lead. The investigators analyzed publicly available family tree databases and were able to identify distant relatives of the perpetrator. Step by step, they reconstructed his family connections until they came across 2 brothers who were living in the Federal Way area at the time of the crime. One of them was Patrick Nicholas. Patrick was 27 years old at the time and already had a history of violent crime. He had been on record for multiple sexual assaults, including against minors. However, in the early 1990s, there was no mandatory DNA collection for offenders in this category. As a result, his DNA had never appeared in the databases, and he had never been officially suspected. The investigators immediately began discreet surveillance. Patrick was now living in the city of Wellington. They watched him around the clock, waiting for an opportunity to obtain a DNA sample. It came sooner than expected. Patrick carelessly threw a smoked cigarette on the floor in a laundromat. Shortly afterwards, he also lost a used tissue. The police secured both items. The decisive evidence was found in the laboratory. Patrick Nicholas's DNA matched exactly that found on Sarah's clothing in 1991. Within a few days, an arrest warrant was issued. Patrick was arrested 28 years after the murder. Patrick Nicholas was immediately charged. But when the media reported on his arrest and made his criminal history public, many asked the same question: How could a man with such a past remain undisturbed for almost 3 decades? At the age of 19, he approached a girl, got into her car, and tried to sexually assault her, causing her to flee in panic. She saved herself by jumping into a river. Patrick spent 4 years in prison for this. Later in 1994, he was arrested again for attempting to rape an underage girl. But this time, he was convicted under a law that did not require DNA sampling. His genetic data therefore never entered the database. Investigators searched through thousands of leads, but his name never came up. Decades later, the case finally gained momentum, thanks to genetic genealogy. It turned out that Patrick's grandfather had been adopted. This had changed his surname, which had long misled investigators. It was only when his name finally came up that one of the boys who had found Sarah's body back then immediately recognized him. "That's him. I know for sure," he said. Finally, the witness felt confident. The trial began in 2023. Patrick maintained his innocence. His lawyer tried to challenge the DNA evidence, but to no avail. The experts stated that the match was clear. The traces on Sarah's clothes were his. On May 25th, Patrick Nicholas was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison, effectively life imprisonment. While Sarah's family tearfully thanked the court for the belated justice, Patrick showed no emotion. He had remained unidentified for 28 years, but in the end, the truth had caught up with him.